Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Navigating Your Commercial Lease Options During Uncertain Times. We are so glad to have you with us here this morning. A few quick housekeeping items before we get started. Just to let you know that this webinar will be recorded today. So if for some reason you needed to leave early, but why on earth would you want to do that? We will send you a link to the recording later, so go ahead and look for that, as well as a lot of other helpful information in your inbox coming later today. Also, this webinar will run for 50 minutes, and then we will have 10 minutes of Q&A following the end. If you have a question for our speaker today, go ahead and put it in the Q&A box in your Zoom toolbar. To get to that toolbar, you just hover your mouse to the bottom of your screen or the top. You'll see the Zoom box pop up, and then you just click the Q&A and pop it in there. So with that, I am going to hand it over today to my partner, Pam Bustos, to get us started. Take it away, Pam.
Hello, everyone. As Jill mentioned, my name is Pam Bustos, and I'm a tax partner with LSL CPAs. I have over 25 years of experience in taxation and consulting, primarily for high net worth individuals and their closely held companies, many of which have a large focus of their wealth in real estate. I'm excited to be hosting this webinar for you all today, as I think this is a very timely topic given our new 2020 reality with so many of us working remotely. Therefore, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker to you today. David Marino is Executive Vice President and co-founder of Hughes Marino, an award-winning commercial real estate firm committed to only representing tenants in their lease and purchase transactions of commercial space. He's been exclusively representing tenants since 1991, completing over 15 million square feet, comprised of over 1,000 transactions. He's an expert in the strategic planning, market assessment, financial analysis, business term structuring, and negotiations aspects of commercial real estate. David has been a featured speaker at dozens of industry events, including the graduate schools at USD and USC, and is considered to be a regional thought leader on commercial real estate and corporate use of space. David has an in-depth command of the entire facility lease, purchase, and disposition process, and is well-versed in areas of space planning, design, and construction issues. Therefore, take it away, David.
Pam, thank you for the introduction. What I do want to, before we jump into the presentation, I do want to elaborate on is this idea that the company Jason Hughes and I started, where we've now been in business almost 3 decades, was founded to only represent tenants exclusively. And why that matters is because our competition, the big traditional full service brokerage firms, do a masterful job of representing landlords and property owners. The problem is when it comes to a market like the one we're in, where things are going south quickly, they're really being called upon to backstop landlords and price support them. And as a tenant representation only firm, whether the market is hard or soft, we're out there just telling the truth. We're calling the balls and strikes and reporting the news, and very often making the news. And so our perspective on what's happening is with no agenda. It is this pure integrity-based assessment of the market to share with your business owners who either own buildings or are tenants themselves what is happening out there, and what the real truth is. The V-shaped recovery is not happening. It's not ever going to happen as it relates to commercial real estate. And so I just want people to know that this is the no spin zone. We're not here trying to prop up the market or trying to sell some sort of story. This is really what's happening from the thousands of conversations we've had throughout the country with executive team members and business owners over the last 7 months. So here's what's going on. And by the way, I've been doing this now for 31 years, the first 2 years after getting my MBA at USC on the landlord side at Trammell Crow Company as a real estate developer, and now 29 years representing tenants exclusively, having done thousands of transactions for office headquarters, manufacturing facilities, distribution facilities, research facilities. And I've been through the early 90s recession. I've been through the tech wreck of 2000 and the 08-09 financial crisis. And this time it's different in that it's worse. The first thing that's happened is there's a tsunami of office inventory coming to the market, where literally the availability and vacancy rates are increasing by the day, and there is anemic demand. And I thought of an analogy this morning to frame this, Consider office building landlords as if they were car manufacturers. And one day, the middle of March, everybody woke up and realized that they were going to stop driving, that all the cars were abandoned and parked in garages, and everybody just walked. Well, that's what it's like for office landlords today. Corporate America, for the most part, has effectively abandoned the office space. And depending which landlords you talk to, estimates are that only 15 to 20% of the occupants are actually coming back to these landlords. And they can do that by counting the parking cards. So building owners like the Irvine Company and Kilroy and others that have buildings with parking cards, they can tell every day how many people are coming into the office. They can eliminate the guesswork. Well, it's basically been stalled at between 15 to 20% really throughout the state of California, and less in some markets like San Francisco. So what this did as office space started coming to the market, and I'll get into the details around that, is we had an immediate supply and demand imbalance that started in March, where demand effectively went away and supply started hockey sticking. And already year to date, rents have gone down for office space an average of 20%, because what we're seeing now is not only a reduction of rent. So for example, with Irvine Company and the Spectrum in their two-story buildings, we would typically be doing a rental rate in the mid twos. We're now doing those rental rates in the $1.90 to $2 range. So the face rate is off 20%, and we're typically getting 3 to 5 months of free rent on a 5-year lease. And in the short term, what happens is landlords start flooding the market with free rent in order to prop up their face rates. Well, the Irvine companies both reducing rent and increasing face rates, and frankly, stealing market share away from other landlords who don't have that flexibility to lower prices. What's really shocking is face rates throughout California and really the major office markets around the country are unchanged from pre-COVID. So if you were a tenant looking at LoopNet or other free sites, you would see the same pricing today at the end of October that you saw in the middle of March of this year. And it's because there is this tremendous inefficiency in our industry where the bid ask is not publicly known. And you actually have to be in the market doing deals real time to really understand what's happening. So already we've got a 20% plus decline in rents. I think by the end of next year, it's going to easily be 30%. And in certain markets like San Francisco, as much as 40%. In fact, we're in a market right now in San Francisco where it's severely in distress. And we are seeing subleases on the market already in San Francisco at 30% off pre-COVID prices. And even those are stagnant and sitting on the market and not moving. So there's really two trends that are driving this office space availability increase. And I think these are going to be intuitive to most folks when we get there. You'll be suspecting this has been happening, but I'm going to prove it's true. The first is office trend number one, sublease inventory is spiking. And if you look at the pre-tech wreck, 1999, and pre-mortgage crisis in 2007, about a year before the public realized and the government realized we were in a recession, sublease inventory around the country started spiking. And it happened now like a firestorm. I hate to use the analogy, but literally this is what we call the canary in the coal mine. And if you don't understand that analogy, back in the 1800s, miners in coal mines would use a canary to go with them in the coal mine. And if the canary died, that means the oxygen level was being depleted such that the next person to die was going to be a human. And so sublease inventory from our standpoint is the leading indicator of a coming recession, as well as a significant decline in the quality of the asset class around office space. So let's look at what's kind of happened in the markets here. So this is taking snapshots of San Francisco, Orange County, LA, and San Diego. The blue bars represent pre-COVID, basically the beginning of the year, and the green bars represent where we are in terms of year to date. So you can see San Francisco has basically doubled in the amount of sublease inventory available on the marketplace. LA has almost doubled. These are markets that are more comprised of large center business districts with a lot of high-rise buildings where tenants simply have abandoned the urban core or have abandoned trying to operate in high-rises. And so in the Bay Area in San Francisco, we're also seeing flight from the city. The bloom is off the rose in a big way in San Francisco. It's become too expensive to live. You hear complaints about homelessness and crime, drug abuse, not being able to get your kids into school, and people are fleeing the city, and employers are fleeing the city. And as a result, they're dumping all their space in their wake. And just to put it in perspective, these are historic high numbers. We've never in our lifetime seen this much sublease inventory in the marketplace, both in LA and in San Francisco. In fact, historically, the record high previously was the end of the tech wreck in 2002, when there was about 5.6 million square feet of office space on the market for sublease in San Francisco. And as you can see, we're screaming towards 9 million with no end in sight. And just to put it in perspective, this is 8% of all of the office space in San Francisco. So 8% of all the office space in downtown San Francisco is now on the market for sublease, competing with landlords. And these are prices that, again, these advertised prices are 25 to 35% off what the same landlord is trying to charge for their vacant space in the building. You'll see, though, in San Diego and Orange County, not so severe. And we think that's because we have a more diversified industry base in Orange County and San Diego that make up a lot of healthcare and medical device and life sciences, as well as other services that are not quite as tech-centric. And in Los Angeles, the entertainment community is getting hammered as well, since all entertainment production is basically evaporated. So different industry concentrations in those markets that are making it tougher in those regions than Orange County and San Diego. So things are better here. We also in Orange County and San Diego have less of an urban core. You know, we have more distributed 2-story and 4-story office environments that companies are operating in more comfortably. And so employers don't seem as motivated to abandon the office space in the San Diego and Orange County area. I do want to talk about industrial, though. This is the first time in the prior 3 recessions I've seen where all asset classes were not hit simultaneously. And what I mean by that is normally office space and industrial get hit hard at the same time. We now have something that is distinctly different in this economy. First of all, there is tremendous strength in the medical device and biotech industry. They've raised billions and billions of dollars since March, and there have been several million square feet of medical device and biotech transactions happen in Southern California year to date. And also, as the recession and the shelter-in-place order came down in March, a lot of the e-commerce companies in April and May tried to operate with the footprints they had and quickly realized they needed more labor and more warehouse space to fulfill the increased demand from consumers around e-commerce. So as you all know, you're all buying more online now, and everybody else in the country is too. And guess what? Amazon, in response to that, has leased 135 new sites around the country, literally tens and tens of millions of square feet around the country. So, and all of their e-commerce companies have as well, whether they be food distributors or Target or other companies. Industrial is actually performing quite well. And let me do a screenshot just to show you in contrast. This is sublease space for industrial real estate. First in Los Angeles County, the blue line being pre-COVID, January 1, the green line being where we are today. So you can see Los Angeles sublease inventory has actually gone down. Inland Empire sublease inventory has been cut in half. And so there's been strong demand for industrial space in those markets to support primarily the e-commerce industry. So industrial is really an outlier. And my presentation is going to focus mostly on the story behind office space. But medical device, biotech lab space, and industrial space is strong, stable, and vacancy rates are really unaffected by COVID, which has really been a shock and unexpected. Here's office space trend number 2, and this is something we didn't see coming, but there were a lot of companies, mostly small to medium-sized companies under 20,000 square feet of office space, that had not yet transacted pre-COVID and had leases expiring the end of June this past summer through Q1 of next year. And I personally have had all but one of my clients, and I represent a lot of companies personally, I've had all but one of my clients that had a lease expiring from this past summer to Q1 of next year decide that they're going to abandon the office entirely. They're not going to renew. They're not going to have any premises of any size, and they're foregoing having office space until a post-COVID reality. And this is the case for thousands and thousands of companies throughout the state, and probably tens of thousands nationally, is that companies have determined, business owners and CEOs, that if they happen to be in the good fortune of having a lease expiring in the short term, that they're just relinquishing the space. They're handing the landlord the keys. And basically the landlord is now putting that space on the market. What you see when you do a survey for clients, in my case, if I'm looking for 5,000 or 10,000 square feet in Irvine Spectrum, I'll see all kinds of opportunities listed by the Irvine company and other landlords, that the space is available December 1 of this year, or April 1 of next year, or even June 1 of next year. And so there is a flood of space that has come to market, and more coming to market as tenants basically relinquish their space. And you can start to see the effect of this now on what's happened in Orange County to Class A office space. So there are two lines here if you look at this graph, and they're both important to understand. The brokerage community, as I mentioned, backstops landlords. And for your entire career, you've probably heard brokers talk about vacancy rates. Well, vacancy rates are a distortion of the market. What vacancy measures is space that's on the market for lease or sublease that is physically vacant. Okay, so that would be like if you were looking to buy a house in Corona Del Mar and you said to your agent, "Hey, I only want to see the 4-bedroom homes that are vacant and available for sale." Well, who would ever do that, right? You only want to see all of the spaces that are available for sale, all the houses, right? So in most of those houses, somebody's living in them, right? They're not vacant. Well, commercial real estate landlords and brokers and lenders have fallen into the same trap. They talk about vacant space, but the problem is there's millions of square feet of space on the market for lease or sublease that aren't vacant. Okay, for example, the space I just described that the Irvine company might have listed for December or April of next year, that is available but not vacant. Or the sublease inventory that's on the market. That space, because somebody's in occupancy, Pam, let's say that you're sitting in your office, one person, and you all were trying to sublease your space, which you're not. The brokerage community would call that occupied space. It wouldn't be classified as vacant. So what we look at as a firm is what's happening with availability, okay? Now you're going to see from these trend lines, Class A office space in Orange County, vacancy is going up. And so if you saw a brokerage report, they'd say it's going from 14 to 15%. And you would say, well, that doesn't sound good, but that doesn't sound so bad. But what if you read a report that said in Q1 availability was 18% and now it's going to 23%? You would probably think the market's in pretty bad shape. Okay, well, that's the reality of where we are. The market is in bad shape and it's getting worse by the day. And I forecast, I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I forecast that if we have this seminar again, the end of 2021, end of next year, that orange line will be up at 30%. So, and I would forecast that is going to be the case in many major markets around the United States. Landlords and their brokers are going to fall on their backs with the shock that is coming their way with the flood of available office space for lease, or as tenants have migrated out and not renewed their lease, that this line is going up and to the right for the next year to 2 to 3. And I cannot tell you where it ends, but it does not end well for building owners and landlords. Here's another way to look at the market. This is for Orange County Class B space. So these are, the less sexy buildings that aren't the high rises. They're not the steel frame buildings with granite. These are the, 2 and 3 story concrete tilt up, Irvine Spectrum and other markets type buildings. And you can see things are better here for landlords, but still moving in the wrong direction. And I think what this tells you is that you're going to see and are seeing a flight from Class A to Class B. You're seeing a flight from the high rises where you have multi-tenant buildings with multi-tenant floors to tenants wanting to be in things where they might not have to ride an elevator, or they might not have to share the bathrooms on the floor with 4 other tenants. So things are clearly not as bad in Class B as they are in Class A buildings, but obviously still go in the wrong direction for landlords. Here's just a snapshot of one submarket. Here's what's happening in the airport area. Again, really staggering situation, and showing how the Orange County airport area is really the worst performing market in Orange County right now, or at least one of the worst, with 21% availability. And again, I think this ends next year closer to 30%. And if people, using my car analogy, don't get back in and start driving cars again, who knows where that line goes by 2022 or 2023. We could be into the worst commercial real estate market we've seen since World War II. We certainly are going into the worst commercial real estate market we've seen in my career in 30 years. These numbers are going back to what the early 90s looked like, where we had a gross overdevelopment of commercial office buildings. This time, though, the supply of space is not caused by overdevelopment, but caused by tenants effectively abandoning the office space. So it's bad, but it's going to get worse. And so I've kind of hinted at this. There's two other things happening in office space that's going to make it worse than it is today. The first is, we estimate that between 4 to 8% of office tenants are in default of their lease and haven't been paying rent since March, or if they got PPP money, they exhausted that this summer and now are in default. The issue, though, is that landlords aren't suing tenants yet. You have these eviction moratoriums that are still in place with various municipalities in the state, and commercial tenants and landlords get treated under the same laws that are really intended for residential and consumers. And so coming at the beginning of 2021, it's going to be a pretty rough time on those tenants who are in default, unless they cease business operations and just shut the business down. We think that landlords are going to start suing tenants in mass for breach of contract in order to make a financial claim against the tenant. But what they probably won't do is they're not going to do the 3-day notice and try to get possession of the space, because California law puts a burden on landlords to mitigate the default if the landlord takes possession of the space. So landlords and their attorneys right now are trying to figure out how to game the system against tenants to get what's owed to them without getting possession of the physical space. But the end result of all of this means that more space is coming to market next year.
David, we had a quick question I wanted to put out there. Someone's asking, are the numbers similar to retail space commercial tenants?
Wow, they're worse in retail. And it depends where you're talking about. Certain categories of retail are almost completely in default. Most movie theaters are in default and haven't paid their rent. And the more you're in an urban core, the worse it is. So, for example, in New York City, it's estimated that 80% of retail tenants are in default right now. And that's because those retail tenants generally rely on tourism, which has gone away, and the business community to come into the city and engage services, which is not happening. So imagine that you own a restaurant in Times Square, you're gone, right? It's game over for you. And so all of these restaurants and other service retailers in central business districts are all under siege right now. And the ones that are surviving and doing well are obviously the grocery stores and the other essential services. But folks that operate gyms and hair salons and these other retailers that have been sidelined by the virus and by actions of the governor or specific counties are really struggling. And this struggle is going to go deep into next year. And a lot of their customers have gone away. I mean, I just got my hair cut yesterday, and my hairstylist said that he's off 30% in terms of his revenue and had to lay off all but one of his staff. So, this is really hitting Main Street in a big way. The chaos around retail real estate is certainly the worst, and far worse than office space. So let me talk about this second thing that's going to happen, right? So there's a second thing brewing that landlords and their brokers don't understand. And what that is that when tenants come back, and they will, most will, I think people are going to realize that remote working isn't working for most people ultimately next year. When they come back, everybody's coming back smaller. And the reason is because there have been millions of layoffs in white collar categories. And so companies that have laid people off need less space. There have been a comfort level now with employers letting employees work remote, and that is becoming long-term an employee benefit and recruiting retention advantage. And it's estimated that anywhere from 5 to 20% of employees will work full remote post-COVID. And so we've spoken to law firms and accounting firms and tech companies and engineering firms, you name it. And for office space users, business owners and CEOs have gotten comfortable with certain employees working remote if they can be productive and not having to commute. And guess what? You don't have to provide office space for those people anymore, right? Additionally, a good number of people, and we've heard estimates of anywhere to 10 to 30% want to work part-time remote, maybe coming into the office a day or two a week, which means you can accommodate those people in the workplace simply by hoteling, right, and office sharing. So if you start to layer this, right, and say, okay, we've got layoffs plus full-time remote employees plus hoteling caused by part-time remote employees, we believe, and what we're finding with transactions we're already working on for 2021, that your average office tenant's going to come back 50 to 80% of the size that they were pre-COVID. And this is going to last for years. So as tenants lease expire in 21, 22, 23, 50,000 square foot tenants become 30,000 square feet. I mean, I've got clients I'm representing right now. I've got an investment management fund that's in 50,000 square feet of office space with a lease expiring next September, and they're coming back at 25,000 square feet. I've got a lending organization that is in 44,000 square feet right now with a lease expiring in February of next year, and we're in the market for 22,000 square feet. Literally, these are 50% off numbers. And so, and these are just not anecdotal. These are active examples across our client base of companies coming back smaller. Well, what does that mean for office space supply? Okay, what it means is a flood of office space supply and a phenomenon that we call negative net absorption. Negative net absorption is the net effect of tenants leasing space in contrast to how much space they relinquish. So if you, using my examples, if a 50,000 square foot tenant becomes 25,000 square feet, that's negative 25,000 square feet of absorption, negative net absorption. So let's imagine in 2021, 2022, 2023, tens of thousands of office tenants in the state of California and hundreds of thousands nationally, all resizing one day at a time. And I call this death by 1,000 slices. This is what kills landlords. This is where the really bad news is that availability and also vacancy is literally going to spike by the week starting in January of next year. It is just going to be up and to the right with no end in sight as corporate America eventually resizes themselves. And I think this is a phenomenon that's going to last for at least 3 years. So this is why I made the claim at the beginning that this is going to be the strongest tenants market we've seen in a couple of decades. It is going to be really, really bad for building owners, but it's going to be really, really good for commercial tenants. So I'm going to get into some kind of blocking and tackling here, get a little more micro. A number of tenants will be facing either trying to sublease some or all of their space, or as your lease expires, you're going to be looking at sublease space because those are going to be 20, 30% below market. They're going to be furnished. They're typically going to have a shorter term than landlords are willing to do. So here are just a few tips if you're looking at subleases or in the sublease topic. So the first thing is, if you are going into a sublease, you need to make sure you evaluate the credit of the sublessor. In other words, the tenant that's trying to sublease, because if they're a sick company and they default on the sublease that you enter into, the default of that master lease wipes out the sublease. In other words, if the tenant stops paying rent to the landlord and the landlord puts them in default and wipes out the master lease, your sublease is gone. So you no longer have any rights. And so you need to make sure that you don't get into a toxic sublease. And this is something that people don't take seriously enough, because I've seen many cases where then the landlord wants to come in and force you into a new long-term lease at market rents. And you obviously don't have any leverage because you don't have any rights to the premises. And if you are, though, going into a sublease, make sure you get ownership of all of the furniture and any equipment up front in the event there is a sublessor default. I had a situation with a big company in San Diego that was called Peregrine Systems. It was a huge public company. I had a 12, and this was 20 years ago, lesson learned early. We had a 12,000 square foot client called Mir 3, sublease from them with all the furniture. And Peregrine Systems got in trouble with revenue recognition and ultimately went out of business and went into bankruptcy. And they defaulted on the leases. And as a result, my client lost their sublease, but also a trustee on behalf of Peregrine came in and made a claim to all the furniture. And so not only did we lose the benefits of the space, we lost the benefits of the furniture, and I had to move them out in 30 days into another furnished sublease. So this is something to be very cautious of. The other thing to be really cautious of is if you're a subtenant, you want to have any deposits in the form of a letter of credit, not cash. Because if you put a cash deposit down on a sublease and the sublessor defaults, you're never getting your cash back. It's gone. And sometimes people ask about what's going to happen to WeWork and Spaces and Industrious. I believe it's the end of days for these organizations. Right now, many of them are in default of their leases globally. A lot of their leases are set up into special purpose entities and LLCs, and so it makes default easy. And so I don't see how these executive suite organizations survive. You know, they're all locked into long-term leases at increasing rents in a market that is, you know, going down 20, 30, 40%, that is flooding with sublease space that's furnished, that'll offer short-term deals. And that was really the benefit of WeWork to begin with, right? It was all about short-term, fast, furnished. You didn't have to put any capital into the space, but you paid a lot of money per head to be in that environment and for those flexibilities. But I think the days of sharing the kombucha bar are over. And I don't see my clients going in and using communal spaces like these organizations provide anymore. So I saw in the early 90s, virtually all of the executive suites around the country, except for Regis and maybe Barrister, went out of business. And I don't even remember if Barrister survived or not, but they're still around and thriving. But this is going to be really tough on co-working and executive suites operations. And I don't recommend anybody, frankly, get into leases or contracts with these folks, at least in the United States, because I think they're going to be tough times on these industry sectors. People are starting to throw around the idea of lease restructuring or lease renegotiating or blend and extend, and I've done hundreds of these. And I want to sort of demystify what this means and explain what it's about. So a lease restructuring is a reduction in your rent or a reduction in the premises size for the tenant for the remainder of the lease in exchange for an extension of the lease, okay? And that extension of the lease is 3 to 5 years, typically beyond the current expiration date. And let me tell you what a lease restructuring is not. And I talked to a company in San Francisco last month that made this mistake. They had 2 years left on the lease. The landlord came to them and gave them 2 months free in order to add 2 years onto the lease. The problem is they added 2 years onto the lease at increasing rents on their current ending price. Well, already by today's pricing, they're 30% above market. And in 2 years, when their lease expires, they would probably be 40 or 50% above market. And now they've extended that horrible, horrible rent another 2 years at increasing CPI or increasing increases. And they're going to be above market for yet 2 more years. And all they got for that was 2 months free today. And so that is a bad deal. That is a horrible deal. But that is what landlords are going to tenants with today to try to trick them into extending leases prematurely at what are sure to be grossly above rental rates in the future. Okay, that is not a lease restructuring. A lease restructuring. Yeah.
David, I wanted to ask a question. What are your thoughts on those tenants that are under long-term lease agreements? How can they get out of a lease?
Great question. So let me finish talking about a restructuring, because that's going to apply to some of these folks. And then if people have leases that are longer than 2 years, I can talk about that. So for those of you that are eligible for a lease restructuring, you really need 3 things to come together simultaneously. The first is the market has to materially corrected and changed, and all the landlords and the brokers agree that the bottom is either here or it's coming soon. Well, that hasn't happened yet. you still have a great delusion going on with most landlords and many brokers. They don't understand how bad this really is because they're looking at vacancy rates, not availability, and they're looking at asking rents that haven't changed. And they are still talking about some V-shaped recovery that is never going to happen. Okay, so the community isn't in consensus that the market is horrible, and that is going to start happening next year. The second thing that needs to happen is you have to have a lease expiring within 2 years, because in 2021 and 2022, landlords are starting to freak out about the stability of their portfolio. I am actually doing transactions with the Irvine Company right now into late Q4 of next year and early Q1 of 2022, where I'm able to get them to the table and give us free rent in 2021 and lower the rents and start to restructure these things. But they're really the only one of the few leaders in getting out in front of this thing. Most landlords are still limited by lenders and partners and expectations that they're not going to be able to meet and can't be creative. The Irvine Company is the one landlord that's starting to get creative. And it's only going to get more creative as we get into next year. But folks with 2021 and 2022 expirations, we should be talking in the next 90 days about what your strategy is around potentially renegotiating, lowering your rent, accelerating free rent, reducing your premises, or potentially getting ready to move if necessary, if your premises just doesn't work for you. The third thing that has to happen is you have to have decent financial condition. You don't have to be Intel or AT&T, but as long as you can demonstrate reasonable financial condition that you can perform for the extended lease term, those are tenants that landlords want to keep. Okay, so we are too early to really talk about restructurings whereby we reduce your rent for the remainder of the term. But starting next year, it's going to become the wild, wild west. And as we get into next year, tenants with 2022 and 2023 expirations become people that we want to talk to about lease restructurings, because by the end of 21, the market's going to be a mess and landlords are going to want to keep their important customers that have 2022 and 2023 expirations. For someone today that has a lease expiring out in 2023 or longer, we're really, at this point, looking at sublease strategies for those tenants if they have excess space or they want to relinquish their entire space because they're just too early. Unfortunately, landlords aren't worried about 2023 yet or 2025. This is going to be the fight of your life if you're a landlord. And it is going to be a fight for survival. And so landlords are really focused on how do we get through next year? And then next year, they're going to start thinking about how do they get through the next year or 2 years. So for folks that have 2023 and longer expirations, it's really a sublease strategy, or I'm working with another client to do an asset sale where they're basically pulling all the assets out of their corporation, forming a new corporation and leaving the liabilities behind, whereby then the lease would automatically default and they would be able to get out of it that way. But you have to have a very specific capital structure in order to consider something that severe. But default is not an answer, unfortunately. You're not going to get the landlord to come negotiate with you when you're in default. That just ends badly. So hopefully that answered the question. Let's talk about how this is going to affect the market in 2021. I've sort of hinted at some of these things already, but the first thing that is really going to shock everybody is that you don't need the kind of critical path and planning horizon that you used to. If we can all sort of rewind our mind to pre-COVID back in Q1 of this year, if you had a lease expiring in the first half of 2021 and you're a 20 to 50,000 square foot tenant, you would be getting after it, right? You'd want to have a 12-month planning horizon because there wasn't a lot of space, competition for space, and the market is going up. And you want to lock in early, either to renew or to move somewhere else. Well, and also people needed to plan ahead because there typically were not good second generation options to lease. And there's very little sublease space on the market. So you were typically looking at a large tenant improvement project, which, by the time you design, engineer, permit, and construct the space, you got an 8 or 9 month project. So tenants that were sizable pre-COVID would typically have a 12 to 18 month planning cycle on a large lease expiration. Okay, well, those days are gone. The market is going to be flooded with second generation space, either through defaults, downsizing, or subleasing. This is already happening. And so we're telling our clients, look, be patient, okay? Don't rush into the market. I'm seeing some tenants in the market already right now for next summer or next fall. And I think it's a big mistake because the market is only going to serve up more options in the next 90 days, and they're only going to be cheaper, and landlords are only going to be more motivated. And so this is a market where patience will reward tenants that are willing to be patient. I just had a client, I do work nationally for my customers. I just had a client in Miami with a lease expiring at the end of the year. And the reason I got this customer is because a new CFO came in who's a client of mine from another company, and he engaged me to represent him. And he was very worried that we're 90 days away from expiration. And I said, don't worry about it. Landlords are terrified that I'm going to move you to another building down the street that can accommodate you. And there were 15 buildings to move these folks to. And any landlord would die to have them. And so we actually negotiated a renewal with 3 months free rent and a tenant improvement allowance that it could take as a credit towards rent. And that's on a renewal. That was unheard of 9 months ago. Okay, that just wasn't happening. So around the country, there's absolute chaos in office space. And so you just don't have to have the long planning horizons that you used to. We can negotiate great deals in the short term. The second phenomenon we're seeing already, and that we're only going to see more of, is that the days of the 5 and 10 year lease are gone. I've been shocked historically about how many tenants have been manipulated by landlords and brokers into signing 10-year deals, because you just don't have to do that. Even pre-COVID, 5 years was really, what landlords were generally looking for. But as we go into this new market, landlords are going to be willing to do 2 and 3 year leases. And certainly on subleases, there's going to be a lot of space available with 2 and 3 years of remaining term left on the master lease. So, for business owners and companies and executives that are on this call, the days of having to make long-term commitments are gone. And, hopefully people are expecting that their business might recover in 2 or 3 or 4 years. There's certainly tremendous uncertainty for everybody. And so, locking into long-term leases is going to be something that tenants don't want to do and don't have to do. And so if, some broker's trying to convince you have to do a 5-year deal, I would tell you fire him and find a new broker. Number 3, tenants are just going to have more choices, and there's not going to be any competition for space. I have a client in Aliso Viejo right now that was looking for 3,000 to 5,000 square feet. And they said they'd be within a 10-mile radius, which is typically wider than a typical tenant would look at, right? In Aliso, normally they would just stay in Aliso. And when I came back with the market report, they had 74 options, literally 74 options within a 10-mile radius of Aliso. Now, as you know, that goes up into the southern edge of Irvine Spectrum and southern edge of the airport area. And so it's a big geography. But the number of options for tenants really of any size range is overnight becoming overwhelming. And so what we're doing with clients is we're saying, look, let's focus on, a more specific geography. Let's focus on subleases if we're looking for something furnished and plug and play and below market and shorter term. Let's focus on pricing, who really is wanting to get aggressive out there in the market, and trying to shorten the list, because customers of ours are just becoming overwhelmed with the number of decision opportunities they have. The fourth trend we're seeing already is just this massive repricing of office rents. You're going to be able to get Class A space for Class B prices, and already pretty much can, or less. And the last phenomenon we're going to see is the credit enhancements that landlords typically demanded pre-COVID are going to go away. So any notion of a personal guarantee is a ridiculous request. The idea of getting big letters of credit on leases is going to go away. Most sublessors are going to require a month's security deposit, because typically when they're making a credit evaluation of a sublessee, they're looking for someone who can just pay the rent, and almost kind of the fog and mirror test. And so, if you find a landlord who wants more than a month or two of a letter of credit, I would say move on and find someone else who will tie up less cash. Then there's going to be a lot of changes to the workplace that are going to come out of this. What we're seeing right now is a very slow emergence as employees are just hesitant to go into the office. And you've got some markets like San Francisco and New York City, where employees don't want to get on, the train, right? They don't want to get on the subways. They don't want to get on BART. They don't want to ride a bus. And so you've got tremendous fear for people's health and safety of employees not wanting to go back to the office. So not only the fact of being in the office and sharing now the space with coworkers, but sharing restrooms with people they don't know on the floor, sharing elevators with people they don't know, and just getting to the office. And so tremendous anxiety from employees, particularly in California. If you go to Texas and Arizona and some of these other states, people are like, yeah, let's just get back to work. And so not as severe as the state of California. The other thing you're going to see is what I call the death of bench seating. So these are where people are sitting sort of across from each other and sort of almost shoulder to shoulder, where you're working at a 24-inch deep by 42-inch wide workstation, and you got rows of people. And these are more in customer service center environments or tech companies, software, internet companies, architecture firms. But we're going to see a return to 6x6, 6x8, 8x8 workstations that have partitions, not the old ugly fabric beige partitions, but washable surfaces and things that prevent more hygienic privacy and isolation of employees than we've been seeing over the last 10 years. So there's going to be a pivot in the furniture industry that's already occurring about what employers look for as appropriate workspace. And then, we're going to see remote working for many companies, here to stay, certainly through the end of the year and deep into next year. I see a general kind of break with companies that are under 50 employees wanting to kind of have people work remote and not have office space, and not go in and try to struggle through it. But companies that have more than 50 employees are really, really starting to try to get people to come back into the office and get re-engaged. There's all kinds of articles out there that you can find now about how remote working is really falling apart. People are getting, fatigued by calls like this of getting to know their colleagues over Zoom, or trying to solve problems over Zoom or communicate. People are not working full days, and those that are having work-life balance issues, health issues, mental health issues, physical health issues. And so, I think by the time, Q2 rolls around next year and we will have been operating like this for a year, people are pretty much going to be ready to throw in the towel and try to get either back in the office or get their employees back in the office. And that's really it. So, the silver lining on this, a lot of times people leave these presentations a little bummed out. And if you're an office building landlord, I can see why you'd feel that way. But for those of you that are tenants and that have leases expiring in the next 2 or 3 years, the silver lining on this is, everybody is under cost pressure right now. Everybody is fighting for their life, with some exceptions. There have been some beneficiaries of the virus, but most of us, mere mortals with regular businesses that haven't, benefited from the virus and from people working at home, are struggling and trying to figure out how to size down their office structures. And so, and we're a great example of it. We've got 6 offices throughout the West Coast. We're opening our Denver office coming up in the next couple of months, and we're hiring and we're growing. But our East Bay office, which is in Walnut Creek, our lease expired in June, and that team's still working full remote. Our Irvine office expires next year, and we're either going to renegotiate that or downsize it or move it or something. And then LA comes up the following year. So, while businesses are under tremendous cost pressure and you've all cut headcount and cut every expense you can, everybody's lease is coming into your gun sights. And there's going to be tremendous opportunity in the next couple of years to not only right size, but bring your cost structure down. And you might think about a company that can, reduce their footprint by 30% and reduce their rent by 30%. All of a sudden post COVID, you're paying 30-40% of what you were pre-COVID. So if you can lean down and we can get into more cost-effective space or renegotiate your lease, we're talking about major impacts to the bottom line for tenants in this environment. So I think the silver lining on this is, this market for tenants couldn't be coming at a better time, where we're all trying to get more cost effective, and we're going to be able to make that happen in spades for companies for the next 3 to 4 years. Pam, did we have some questions from folks on the call?
We do have some questions. So I hope I'm getting this right. It was the question was a little broken up, but if the lease is a modified gross lease where the tenant takes care of the interior, who takes care of the things like the electric panel or central AC if the tenant says it's not working?
Yeah, so in any kind of modified gross lease in an office building, the landlord is typically still responsible for all of the common area services and maintenance. So things like HVAC systems, central plant, common area restrooms, elevators, those are things that still should be being serviced by the landlord, unless for some reason those things are within your space or exclusively serve your space and your lease has some other kind of call out for the tenant to be doing the maintenance. So I'm certainly happy to, Pam, talk to that person offline and look at their lease at no cost and no obligation. I mean, that's part of what we're here for. We're here to serve. And if anybody has a specific case study or problem that they're faced with, my email will be sent out and I can set up a call to speak to you next week and just coach you through your situation and help you set up a strategy and do a deep dive into your situation.
Okay, another question. Some retail commercial landlords are offering rent reductions in exchange for a modification to the original lease agreement. For example, forgoing the force majeure language in the original lease. What do you advise to those tenants who are being offered this but don't want to alter those original protections?
Yeah, great question. So what has happened is right when COVID hit and shelter in place started, thousands of really smart attorneys around the country all dove into commercial leases to try to figure out if tenants could take advantage of the force majeure provision in leases. And it was universally agreed that they could not. Force majeure is a provision that basically says that parties are relieved of certain obligations in the event there's a force majeure event that's a strike or an act of God or a war or some kind of civil unrest. But those performance obligations specifically exclude payment of rent in pretty much every commercial lease you'll see. And they're intended really to address things more like, when tenant improvement construction is happening, that if there was a strike and the project got delayed by the landlord, that the tenant couldn't terminate the lease, for example. So, again, that's a specific situation. You might be willing to forego your force majeure provision because it might not be something worth anything anyway, depending how it's written. So, if you can get economic concessions in exchange for non-economic concessions, you might want to consider that. But I think it's really, again, the art form of what I do is it's like a doctor, right? Somebody walks into my office and they've got a pain here and an ache there and a cut there and a bruise there. And I kind of have to figure out what the unique injury is to that specific patient. The same thing is with a lease. My questions would be, who's the landlord, who's the tenant, what's the credit, when's it expire, how much space are we talking about, what are they paying? So you have to sort of look at the holistic condition of the situation one at a time to be able to make the right recommendation. So I don't want to be too generic, but without knowing the exact circumstance, it's a little tricky.
Okay, we have a few more questions. Is there a generally accepted window prior to a lease's expiration in which notice of some sort needs to be provided to the lessor regarding intention or risk an unintended extension?
So, great question. So some leases, particularly executive suite leases like Regus or WeWork, have automatic renewal provisions in them. And so if you don't notify the landlord that you aren't renewing, typically they auto renew. Okay. Most commercial leases, though, for space do not have such a provision. And most commercial leases do not also require the tenant to provide notice that they aren't staying in the space. I think it's a nice courtesy if you've come to the conclusion you're not going to renew and you're not going to stay. I think you should give the landlord as much notice as possible. there are also renewal options in some leases whereby anywhere from 6, 8, 9 months in advance of a lease expiring, you have to exercise a renewal option. We are advising tenants, do not exercise renewal options in this market, because the mechanism of how you price a renewal option looks at historic comps in order to price your rent. Well, the problem is there's very few market clearing transactions happening right now. And there's some really bad deals being signed by tenants where they're not well represented. They're working directly with the landlord, or they're working with the landlord's broker. And frankly, they're getting screwed. I mean, these tenants out there are really getting slaughtered by putting themselves in front of the landlord or the landlord's broker, thinking they're going to get some kind of good deal, and it's not happening. They're leaving money on the table, and they're getting taken advantage of, because you're basically dealing with the fox who watches the hen house. And so, it is the kind of situation where you really want to renegotiate the lease or go to market and look at your options to move. That becomes your leverage to go hammer the landlord. So renewal options have kind of overnight become toxic in a downward moving market. In other words, I look at it this way, Pam. The deal that was signed 3 months ago is probably a really bad deal today, because the market has changed that fast just in 3 months. And so the last thing I would want to have is a client exercise an option and the landlord points to that deal that was signed 3 months ago as the market, when the market's actually already deteriorated another 10%. And by the time the tenant's lease expires next May, could deteriorate another 20%. Okay, because when you're looking at a renewal, we're talking about leases that expire 6 months from now, 12 months from now. Well, the market's only going down. Okay, so the longer we can push my client out into the future, getting closer to that expiration date, while still being eligible to create a relocation strategy, the better off our results going to be.
Okay. Another question, and this has to do with restructuring options. So an attendee has an option to extend in 2022. It has a fixed schedule of rental increments if they choose to extend. Are they able to restructure, reprice the option? They don't want to move out.
Great example. And by the way, good job on getting a fixed price renewal option. It's very hard to get and very rarely seen, and serves you well in a spiking market, in a market that has runaway pricing. And my bet is that lease expiring in 2022, maybe you signed it a couple of years ago, so your option pricing is based on some kind of escalation of your current last year's rent. The problem is, by the time you get to 2022, you're going to be above market. 90% chance. I don't guarantee it, but 90% chance you're going to be above market, and potentially well above market if you're an office tenant. So you're not going to want to exercise your option. Instead, we're going to want to renegotiate. And if you were my client, what I would do next year is position you to relocate to a different building, even though you have no desire to and you don't want to move. Totally respect that. And that's the nice thing about representing tenants is we get paid either way, whether somebody renews or moves. We're indifferent, and it doesn't matter where they move to. We just get paid market commissions. And so we've got no financial dog in the fight to try to create some kind of strategy to move you when you want to renew. And so use the natural leverage of the market to basically determine what your value is and what fair pricing is. And then we put the current landlord into the mix through a negotiation process to have the current landlord negotiating simultaneously with other landlords to move you. And by that way, we create an efficient auction where your current landlord is competing for your business along with 3 to 5 other landlords. And that's how we drive the price down. But you won't be able to renegotiate your option. The landlord, in other words, if you're paying off, let's say you're hypothetically paying $3 a foot in 2022 for office space, and your option's at $325, the landlord's not going to go, well, yeah, the market's $225, so I'll let you exercise the option at $225. You're going to have to put pressure on the landlord. You're going to have to look like you're packing your bags and you've got 1 foot out the door, and use the leverage of the market to basically hammer that landlord.
Okay. We're closing in on 11 o'clock. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. So this would be a quick last call for any last minute quick questions. In the interim, I wanted to thank everyone for attending. We appreciate your time today. I know many of you are dealing with evacuations and fire watch and watching the maps So we appreciate you being here. But I think we're going to wrap it up. I'm going to pass it on to Jill. And again, thank you, David, for your time. We appreciate your insight today.
Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you all again for attending. And once again, remember that you will be getting follow-ups in your email later today, so look for them. And we hope you have a wonderful day, and thanks for joining us. Bye now.
Bye, everybody. Stay safe.